So this is from the Anguttara Nikāya, from the Book of the Threes, a discourse with the Kālāmas of Kesamutta. So have I heard. At one time the Buddha was wandering in the land of the coastal lands together with a large sangha of bhikkhus when he arrived at a town of the Kālāmas named Kesamutta. The Kālāmas of Kesamutta heard, it seems the ascetic Gotama, the Sakyan, gone forth from a Sakyan family, has arrived at Kesamutta. He has this good reputation. That blessed one is an Arahat, fully awakened Buddha, and so on, and then they come to the conclusion, it is good to see such Arahats. Then the Kālāmas went up to the Buddha. Before sitting down to one side, some bowed, some exchanged pleasantries, some held up their joined palms towards the Buddha, some announced their name and clan, while some kept silent. Seated to one side, the Kālāmas said to the Buddha, Bhante, there are some ascetics and Brahmins who come to Kesamutta. They explain and promote only their own doctrine, while they attack, deride, disparage, and smear the doctrines of others. Then some other ascetics and Brahmins come to Kesamutta. They too explain and promote only their own doctrine, while they attack, deride, disparage, and smear the doctrines of others. So, Bhante, we're doubting and uncertain. I wonder who of these respected ascetics and Brahmins speak the truth, and who speaks falsehood. Then the Buddha replies, it is appropriate, Kālāmas, for you to be doubting and uncertain. Doubt has come up in you about an uncertain matter. Kālāmas, don't go by oral transmission, by lineage, by hearsay, by canonical authority, by logic, by inference, by analysis of properties, by the acceptance of a view after consideration, by the appearance of competence, or by the thought, the ascetic is our respected teacher. When you know for yourselves, these things are detrimental, blameworthy, criticized by sensible people, and when undertaken they lead to harm and suffering, then you should give them up. What do you think, Kālāmas, when greed arises in a person? Does it do so for their welfare or harm? And then the Kālāmas reply, harm, Bhante. A greedy individual, overcome by greed, kills living creatures, steals, commits adultery, lies, and encourages others to do the same. Is that for their lasting harm and suffering? Yes, Bhante. What do you think, Kālāmas, when aversion arises in a person? And then it repeats, and then it also talks about when delusion arises in a person. That's all detrimental and blameworthy. Then the Buddha says, so, Kālāmas, when I said, don't go by oral transmission, by lineage, by hearsay, by canonical authority, by logic, inference, by analysis of properties, by the acceptance of a view after consideration, by the appearance of competence, or by the thought, the ascetic is our respected teacher, then, when you know for yourselves these things are detrimental, blameworthy, criticized by sensible people, and when undertaken they lead to harm and suffering, then you should give them up. That is what I said, and that is why I said it. And then it continues in the opposite way. So when you know non-greed arises in a person, non-aversion arises in a person, and non-delusion or middle-mindedness arises in a person, then you should know for yourself that that's beneficial and not blameworthy. Then the sutta continues and says, then that noble disciple is rid of longing, rid of ill will, unmuddled, aware and recollected. He abides having pervaded with a mind of friendliness the first direction, likewise second, third and fourth. In the same way...
the Brahma-viharas.
Huh? Yes.
Goes to the Brahma-viharas.
These are the Brahma-viharas, yes. In the same way above, below, across, everywhere, he abides having pervaded the whole world with a mind of friendliness, abundant, expansive, immeasurable, free of enmity and ill will, and so it goes on for the other three Brahma-viharas. So this is one of the more well-known discourses, the discourses to the Kālāmas, and there's quite a few things to unpack here. So perhaps we can start with the very first thing that the Buddha says, like don't go by tradition, right, oral transmission, logical inference, or accepting a view after pondering it, and so on. If you don't do any of that, then what do you do? And then how do you know that you're practicing rightly? What would people here say?
My first thought is that he's not necessarily dismissing these things as tools, in the sense, like, he's not saying, oh, don't go by logic. A false conclusion to draw from that would be like, okay, then that means the Dhamma doesn't have to be logical, or like things don't have to make sense. But what I get from that is more, don't fall into a complacency of like, okay, just because you've made this logical analysis of, you've put every sutta into a box, you can draw all the parallels, it all makes perfect sense, no contradictions. Not to, like, if that's kind of your baseline, then you're going to be missing the mark still.
And why? What is it that all those things have in common, but that still makes it not Dhamma?
It's not personal, I'd say.
It's not personal. But some people can be very personal about accepting a teacher, for example.
Right.
Or after having spent like 20, 30 years pondering a view, coming to the conclusion this must be right. And then the Buddha comes along and says, well, the fact that you've pondered it for a long time doesn't necessarily mean it's correct. So can there be is there a more accurate factor?
I'm trying to think of something to say that's not just kind of what he followed up with. But since you, like, is it on that personal level where even if that the teacher dies, the beloved teacher, and you forget everything they ever said, are you still free? Well, like the Buddha says, do you still know right from wrong? Do you still know liberation?
The thing there is, the funny thing with the sutta is that the second part is usually left out. It's usually just like, okay, don't go by tradition, don't go by hearsay, don't go by logic. And people quote that as a kind of a testament to how Buddhism is different from other religions, where it's like your own experience is the measure or something. And then the thing is that carries the implication that it's almost like, well, like make your own truth or something like that. Like there's some individual truth and you're supposed to pick what resonates with you and remove the rest or something. But it actually says there, what is it that it's implied though, but it says, what is it that you're supposed to use as a standard? And it says, when greed, aversion, and delusion arises. So, what you said just now of keeping it personal, the thing is like, that's exactly what it is, but you don't do it just by, because you can be personal, but objective. And that's the problem. The problem is like all these permutations of attitudes, the issue with them is you think that something objective, something external, something that's public is what determines right and wrong.
Yeah, that's what all those things to a degree have in common.
Yeah. So even if it's, as it says, your own logic and reasoning, it's something objective that means like, okay, every day I do this, it's right because logically I have made all the right connections. Like it makes sense logically. But if you do something with a mind of greed, even if it makes sense, even if it's what the teacher said, even if it's what the tradition said, it's wrong because it's done with a mind of greed. In other words, the what is rooted in greed, aversion, and delusion, that is the truth, and that's not so presence of greed, aversion, and delusion, and absence of greed, aversion, and delusion, that's the truth.
That's the criteria.
Yeah, that's like that's not debatable in the sense that you're either acting with those things or not. And that's the what I'm saying is it's not saying that there are different truths or something like that you need to find your own. It's saying that's the only defining criteria for
so that is universal but not objective.
Yeah, exactly. So it's because not just objective in the terms of individual people, but in terms of yourself as well. Like one morning you can be having you can be doing something that's seemingly good, like helping someone, let's say, and in the morning it's rooted in a mind of non-greed, non-aversion. You were out of a genuine intention, you were just helping this person, but in the evening you're doing it again, and now it's rooted in just desire for company and distraction. So it's like an sensual desire or whatever. So if you think that, okay, the Buddha said that helping people is good, the Buddha said that, you know, it makes sense that it's wholesome and whatever, and you think about it in that objective sense, you would overlook that actually what's defining the action is what state of mind you have right now.
Yes.
And so it's, and the actions that it says there, well, the precepts in themselves, they're like, if it were possible to kill without a mind of aversion, to steal without a mind of aversion, to lie without a mind of aversion,
or a mind of greed or delusion for that matter.
Yeah. So, or any kind of unwholesome mental state, then these things wouldn't be wrong. It doesn't matter what the tradition says. What matters is these things are wrong because they always carry those mental states. So from that point, if somebody is following the precepts just because the tradition says that you need to follow the precepts, and because that's what Buddhists do, that means that they haven't understood the principle, and they're not trying to understand the principle of what makes those things wholesome, and what makes what makes the abstinence from those things wholesome. So, and it's the fact that, to that extent, you'd have a mindset of less greed, less aversion, and less delusion. And you take that as your standard, and then you take that principle further. But if you just stay on that, that happens often. Like people with meditation and stuff, especially, like you there's this tendency to assume that, okay, if I just do this, if I just go through these motions every day, every time I do it, it's going to be wholesome. That means because somebody told you, really. It's like somebody told you that if you repeat these things, eventually you will get to enlightenment. And that's, again, depending fully on tradition or hearsay, and you're not seeing what is the mental state that I have presently. Is it a mindset of greed, aversion, or delusion? So that I can, if I know that, I can directly cultivate liberation. I don't need to wait for some miracle to happen after I do this practice for 10 years.
So this is with the factor of Siddhartha Paramasa, right? There's this external component there. Conformity is often involved. Finding safety in even if it's self-imposed, I'm going to do this every time in the morning and in the evening, which then allows you to completely overlook, right, sign of the mind and where the intentions actually are, and which is the factor there. And this almost seems to me like a sort of further elaboration of what would be involved in that factor of Siddhartha Paramasa, which prevents one. It's one of the first three factors that prevent one from becoming a noble disciple. And interestingly enough, that sutta continues after the Buddha has listed that, and he says, when this noble disciple knows that his mind is, right? So, and then it's kind of like, well, hang on a minute, how did it suddenly go from Kālāmas who are confused, and then the Buddha suddenly introducing noble disciple? Well, actually, all of that's implied.
Because if you understand, if you fully, actually the Majjhima Nikāya 9, it defines what is a noble disciple. The very first thing it says, it's somebody who understands wholesome and unwholesome, and understands the root of the wholesome and the root of the unwholesome. And what is that root? Greed, aversion, and delusion, non-greed, non-aversion, non-delusion. So if you take that principle to the full extent, and as you see, it starts with the precepts. That's why, that's like the level where everyone will be able to see this. Like if they have a basic degree of self-honesty, they will see that doing those things carries more greed, aversion, and delusion than not doing those things. And with that as a basis, they can start then refining it further, to the point where, verbal actions, and then finally mental actions, which is how you would cultivate samadhi in the end. So,
Yeah, so maybe we can also clear up, like, I mean, in the beginning there will be greed, aversion, and delusion. That's the starting point. So it's not black and white, like there's either full-blown greed, hatred, and delusion, or there's nothing. But it will sort of, right? So you can compare your own experience to a degree, and you can see this is less greedy, this is less aversion. So you can still, it's not completely absent, but within that you can still see this is moving in the right direction, this is certainly moving away from it, and that is the refining of the principle.
Yeah, like I said, it's from this starting point that you are. What mind do I have? What like you would see for yourself, if I just, somebody who's not keeping the 5 precepts, let's say, they would see clearly that if they abstain from those things, they will be moving in the opposite direction of greed, aversion, and delusion. So, but if then you just take it as, that's actually why you would be able to skip the development of virtue many times, wrongly, of course, because you haven't actually understood like why those precepts are wholesome. You just take them conditionally because you think, well, it comes bundled with the whole other aspects of the practice, and then you never actually understood why that foundation was important. So then it feels like you're progressing, but really like the progress was elsewhere. The progress was in understanding why these things were wholesome. It was not in all the other stuff that came afterward when you were doing your meditation.
That's in a sense secondary.
Yeah. So because the Buddha doesn't talk about getting special experiences, the Buddha talks about understanding what mental states are there when you have experiences. So then if you assume that just having experiences is what's wholesome, you would overlook that there can be mental states of longing, greed, and all these sorts of things.
Yeah, you're talking about people trying to get special experiences based on some meditation practice, for example.
And actually, it's there when it talks about the Brahma Viharas after the noble disciple has understood the freedom from longing, aversion, and all these things. Because if you haven't understood those mental states and you try to cultivate any type of meditation, you will be doing it out of what you heard, just following a set of external instructions, even if it's correct, even if it's the Buddha himself who gave you those instructions. Fundamentally, it won't be wholesome because you're not seeing it as, you don't see why it's beneficial. And as the Buddha said, the destruction of defilements can only happen for one who understands. It cannot happen like fortuitously. I just did this because he told me to do it, and then I got the result. If you don't see where you're going, even before you start walking, you cannot get there.
Yeah, so presence of greed, hatred, and delusion, or absence, that is actually what is directly visible Dhamma.
Exactly,
Whereas a tradition or pondering a view, all of that is either not directly visible, or it is not as immediate as seeing whether right now that mind state is affected by greed, hatred, and delusion, and that understanding cannot be taken away.
And it would actually distract you. Putting emphasis on those things would actually distract you, because there's, with the precepts as well, for example, you often have the sort of tacit implication in like spiritual communities and stuff that if we just adhere to this same behavior, we are automatically just take it on. You're supposed to take it on faith that we're automatically going in the right direction if we just adhere to this, no questions asked, and that inherently is actually distracting you from figuring out what is, even if it's wholesome, like even if it's something that the suttas talk about.
Yeah, or Patimokkha training rules for monks, for example.
But if you take it as like, no, I just do this and that's good, you're actually obstructing your own progress, because you're not, you left the work undone of discerning those the background intentions. So and another thing is, as you said, directly visible Dhamma. That's exactly what, another thing that's overlooked, like as the Buddha said, the Dhamma is supposed to be directly visible. So if the Dhamma depends on some experience you're supposed to have that comes later, that is not directly visible.
Yeah, and precisely if you when there is that time interval, I'm doing this and I'm waiting for results.
That's great.
Yeah, but that's also doubt,
Mm.
right? Because you're doing something now, and as long as you don't have a confirmation that you're doing it right, you don't know whether you're doing it right because it's not immediately directly visible.
Yeah.
And all these Kālāmas in that discourse, they were in doubt.
Mm.
You know, all these different people come here. Should we do this? Should we do that? So that so that doubt has to be squeezed out by seeing that right now you can check for yourself individually whether there's greed, hatred, and illusion or not. The moment it becomes time bound, which is how most people unfortunately approach their meditation practice, you will never be able to transcend doubt. And even if you get some special experience, then you would still need to infer afterwards, oh, it must be because I've done this and that. But even then you don't quite know.
Actually, that's a good one. Like, you have the experience, but then you need to go to the teacher to confirm, like, oh, was this the right one?
Yeah. And then he looks it up in the books and the canonical authority, and it says, oh yeah, on page 227 it's confirmed here, so it must be right. Yeah, but this is endless.
Or you get a certificate confirming that yes, you did get the stream entry or something like that. And as it was saying, these different people, they had different listen to different teachers, and you see all of those teachers, if they wanted to, they could prescribe this path of training that if you get to it, you follow through it, you will get to this magical revelation. And they can all say that, that revelation is Nibbana. And the Kālāmas would be totally unable to decide which one is the right one. But you would only be able to know, so which of those paths would actually be more in line with a mind of non-greed, non-aversion, and non-delusion. That would be the final criteria. And that's like the... For anything, for the ascetics and Brahmins back in the Buddhist time that were not practicing as wrongly, it's not because they were adhering to, external guidelines and traditional aspects that were in line with Buddhism. It's simply because they did actually, to some extent, understand the principle of abandoning greed, aversion, and delusion. It's not because they were doing the right jhana technique or something. That's again dependent on canonical authority or whatever. They might have completely different ideas about everything, but the point is, internally, they have to some extent gone in that direction of taming these unwholesome states in the mind, not out of just doing what a teacher says.
I do think it might be worth just kind of talking a little bit more even about the whole view of kind of the view of morality being an external. I think you were saying earlier something can be personal but objective. That is a extremely like ingrained view in the West, especially these days. Just the it's all about kind of consequences of your actions, whether you intend that or not, is sort of just today's social standard of like that's how you judge somebody.
If I do something unintentionally but it results in a bad consequence, then it's immoral.
Right. And that's the way of viewing things these days, and it totally ignores that internal criteria, which is what like you actually have to work with, as opposed to just like mathematically calculating, if I do this, I should account for a butterfly flapping its wings 200 years ago. Like there's
it's you need to use then the standard of the internal state of mind, because I mean the Buddha himself, when he, for example, prescribed the Subha meditation, and these, I don't know how many monks ended up committing suicide, there was certainly no internal desire in him for that to happen, and yet it was not unwholesome because his mind at that point it didn't have greed, aversion, delusion. So then if you think like killing stealing, all the things that the precepts prohibit, they're bad because of what they do to other people, then you might even justify breaking precepts with that logic, because you could say, well, certain things, abstaining from certain things actually makes other people feel bad, or makes their life more difficult, or whatever. So then you would think, oh, so I should actually break these things. But no, it's that internal criteria means that, well, the benefit that comes to you and the benefit that comes to others will usually not be in the dimension of benefit that you conceive to be, which is like just pleasure. It's in the dimension of not further cultivating these states, not only in yourself but in others. So like sexual intercourse, for example, you could think, oh, by not doing this, I am actually maybe making another person unhappy. But that's not the criteria for what's beneficial. It's like, actually, as the Buddha said in that other sutta, where it says that there are people who can happily engage in killing, stealing, lying, and all the unwholesome states, and then there are people who sadly, like with pain and suffering, engage in these things. So that's not what makes it right or wrong, like how they feel. So it's all just that internal dimension that, again, it's not like even up for debate once you start seeing it. One day your mind is with has a greedy inclination, even if the whole world says, no, you should be able to do this. From the point of view of Dhamma, you don't do it. That's actually why the suttas say that Sotapanna becomes independent of the of anybody else's instruction.
Yeah.
Not because they just acquired this logical standard, because as it says, that's not what matters. Or they acquired some perfect system of thought around how to practice. It's because at any time they see their mental state. So even if, well, actually, even in a future life, because as the suttas say, Sotapanna could be reborn up to 7 times and whatnot, they would no longer have the information of the Buddhist teaching that they acquired in the previous life. But what they would have is they still see their own mind. So that's the standard of what's wholesome and unwholesome. The actual standard would remain. So that's another thing. Like any of these, relying on any of these things means that, well, all you have to do really to not be able to practice anymore is get Alzheimer's or dementia. Or you already lost the basis of your practice. But
yeah, so even all the information that you have accumulated, even if it is the right information, right, when that's a good contemplation. When all that goes, right, when all the books are burned, all the teachers, all the YouTube talks, all the rest of it finished, you are on your own and you don't know any of those instructions anymore, right? Instructions in the sense of external information. Then are you sufficiently independent to carry on with your practice towards final goal, right?
But even without those, like, because even if the intellectual clarity fades, the system of Dhamma or whatever goes away. Do you still see mind of greed as mind of greed, mind of aversion as mind of aversion, without any need for other sort of intermediary ways of defining that? You just see it directly. This is a mind of greed, this is a mind of aversion, and I don't act out of it. That's the problem usually, that most practitioners don't see a problem with the fact that they need to use these intermediary sort of tools to determine what is good or bad in terms of the practice.
Yeah, so that's not enough directly visible. There is a buffer in between there that needs to come up for interrogation at some point.
Which is like, sometimes it might even just be how something makes you feel. You assume that as a criteria for what the meaning that's beneficial. And people would say that, like, if this practice makes me feel better than this other one, that means that this one is
therefore good. I'm suffering less. Whereas actually,
but because, as I said, the Buddha said you can be doing unwholesome things with perfect joy and happiness.
Yeah.
So it's not enough to think in those terms. And a further thing to note is that the development of all of the things the suttas talk about, as we mentioned before, it's the practices have to be informed by your discernment of what greed, aversion, and delusion is. Whereas usually we take it the other way around. It's like these practices will lead me to see what greed, aversion, and delusion is. But no, seeing what greed, aversion, and delusion is what makes these practices right. That's why the whole path starts with the right view. So it's not that you just, like the Dhutangas is a good example. Like you assume, okay, I just stick to these determinations. I will not lie down. I will not, eat from as a monk. Like I will not eat from. I will only eat food from alms round.
Only out of one bowl, one session.
I will sleep in the forest. I won't do this. I won't do that. And then you just assume, okay, sticking to this will lead me to the understanding. Whereas no, it's like having the understanding would allow you to contextualize those practices.
Yeah, because somebody could be doing that out of aversion, for example.
Or conceit, or all sorts of expectations that they're not aware of because they don't see that as important. They're fully focused on some objective basis of like what somebody else told them and what they expect to come from it.
Yeah, and so when somebody gets this main principle, that it is the greed, hatred, and delusion that is the guiding factor there, not all the other practices that are common now, then there can still be doubt as to what is the extent of the greed, what is the extent of the aversion, what is the extent of the delusion. When somebody finds themselves still in that intermediate space, so to speak, then what would be good advice for them to carry on?
Well, that's why the Buddha formulated the gradual training. So actually we already did a talk on that. It's you cannot understand, even if you want it, to like the extent of greed that's involved in the 5 hindrances, for example, if you haven't developed your mind to transcend the greed, aversion, delusion of bodily and verbal actions.
Yes.
So that's why you start with that, and it says, when the monk is accomplished in virtue, then I tell him to be sense restrained. When the monk is accomplished in sense restraint, then I tell him to be moderate in eating, and so on, because these are just layers of greed, aversion, and delusion that you're progressively working with. But even just with the basic precepts, if you keep them out of that sense of complacency, because again, because that's what the other monks are doing or something,
or out of duty,
right? Sense of duty, sense of, or the conditional sense of like, okay, if I just do this, it will help the other stuff that I actually regard as important. Then you never actually even took up the first thread of understanding greed, aversion, delusion. And you can review your mental states. Like that's the practice. Like when you're restrained, but then when the desire arises to do these things that you made a determination to give up, is that pleasant or unpleasant? Like, is that suffering, or is it? Because see, you might overlook the fact that, as it says, greed brings harm and suffering, because you usually are able to get what you want quickly enough. But what happens when you just have the greed, but you don't do anything? Is that pleasant or unpleasant? And you will see that it's quite it is what suffering is, basically. So from that point of view, you get to see like, oh, all this, like in the past when I was regarding these actions as pleasant, it's just because like the pleasure of the things I was getting was distracting me from the pain of the mental state that was actually driving me to do those things.
Yeah, but then there are also sometimes people who say, no, just the desire itself is already pleasant, is usually more pleasant, because when you then actually get what you desire, it's always a disappointment, right? So they then rightly see that even if they get what they want, it's initially pleasant, but afterwards it becomes a disappointment. Then they say, therefore, I just stick on the level of the actual desire so as to avoid the disappointment of actually getting it, failing to see that even the desire is more unpleasant still. But why? Because it doesn't leave you alone. It's basically pushing you to act out.
Yeah.
And it's the same with the ill will and the aversion. It is not just optional, like, oh, you could do this. No. It is very much pushing you in that direction, which at the same time you know is not wholesome. And so when the mind is overcome by these unwholesome states, there cannot be peace because it's forcing you to act.
Yeah.
Right?
And if you think it's not forcing me, well, are you sure that you are fully withdrawn from all the forms of greed, aversion, delusion?
That's then it. So when there's doubt, well, I don't feel pressured by my mind, well, then people can either refine their precepts or introduce these further steps of the gradual training, such as sense restraint, moderation in eating. Don't need to be a monk for that. Many people nowadays will have plenty of opportunity to experiment with these things and then see if your mind remains as calm and composed as you think it now is.
And then you will get to see, refine that principle, okay, that now there's greed, aversion, and delusion. And you will get to see that on a more subtle level, if you act out of it, it's going to be for your harm. And then you have a direct criteria to see that is unwholesome.
Yeah.
And then you also see that the Buddha said that's the case. But now you have some amount of direct confirmation.
Yes.
That is not just...
and that is how the doubt goes. Right? Yeah.
And also, it's even for people who are practicing, as it says there, there's the acquisition of a view after consideration, or it's easy to then when you get to a certain point in the practice to start confusing that the fact that things make sense with understanding, and because again it becomes sort of that objective direction, even if it's correct, even if you read the suttas and you factually understood, and then it agrees. That's already quite a lofty goal, by the way. That's very rare. But even if you get to that point, but you still don't see it on that internal level, then that's literally not the Dhamma.
Yeah, that is.
Even if the information is the same.
Yeah.
Because it says the Dhamma can only be known for themselves by the wise.
Yeah, this is why it seems to me that the Dhamma cannot be a system, because a system, even if it is fully internally coherent, is always something separate from from you. So most people, they will be doing things that are also contradictory, but even if those contradictions are resolved and you say that's a system, objective, independently, then no, it has to be. You need to become involved, and the moment you become involved in the system, you can never see the totality of it, because now in a sense you are in it, so you have to discern from within that mind state. So it cannot be objective system.
It's the Dhamma always applies to you. It's never an external collection of information. It's always, the Dhamma is about you. It's like a mirror.
However coherent or logical it might be, which is better than being incoherent and illogical, but that is not the final criteria.
It's like a mirror that you're sort of like examining its properties, whereas the actual purpose of the mirror is supposed to show you like yourself.
Well, exactly.
But you're here occupied with it's 3 centimeters thick, and it's that's basically when you're relating to the Dhamma on that level of information.
I wanted to ask as well, like in the part of the sutta, the Buddha says so acting with a mind of greed, aversion, or delusion is something unwholesome, and then it goes after the part after, he say acting with a greed of non-greed, non-aversion, non-delusion is wholesome. It doesn't say acting with a mind of love, acting with a mind of whatever, peace or joy or whatever. And I wanted to ask why is that so, and why is that important for someone to understand that? Because if you don't, he cannot bring himself to that. He still see that as something external to himself.
Well, the thing is, whenever you approach it through that angle of cultivating positive qualities without having abandoned the negative qualities first, it always becomes like a cover-up. It always becomes something that that's actually like, you don't want to acknowledge the fact that there would be greed if you don't actively fabricate non-greed or renunciation, let's say. You don't want to acknowledge the fact that there would be aversion if you don't actively fabricate love. So for as long as a person thinks that they need to approach these things as activities, as things that they do, they don't see that actually those things would arise by themselves if they abandon the greed, aversion, and delusion. They don't see, as that sutta says, like that the defilements are not inherent to the mind. It's like they come sort of gratuitously. So if you remove those defilements, like if you kind of you have a light bulb, you don't need to like make it shine. If it's not shining because it's covered by something, you don't fix it by making it shine more. You fix it by actually removing what's obstructing it, and then the light bulb is just how it's supposed to be. So that's why the Buddha said, if you don't understand that principle, he said there is no development of the mind. It's just they're just covering up of one thing with another. And yeah, the development of whatever active qualities like renunciation, love, and wisdom, if you think that's what it's saying, where in reality it's saying non-greed, non-aversion, non-delusion, that would always be dependent on, as we said, these external sort of dimensions. Like somebody told you how to cultivate renunciation, love, or whatever. You didn't see it for yourself.
Yeah,
that's when it would be.
Yeah, and also there would be actually logically a contradiction in that. Like, how can you gradually build up love if aversion hasn't been abandoned? That's a contradiction. You cannot have aversion and at the same time start building up love or friendliness. So the friendliness begins with the complete absence of the aversion. So the whole thing is an uncovering or an undoing.
Yeah.
And this is also why this famous Ovada Patimokkha, right, which is sometimes quoted as like a summary of what the Buddha teaches. The first line is that he refrains from doing something unwholesome, and then he develops what is wholesome. It doesn't start by saying you develop what is wholesome, and then afterwards you could consider whether you also undo what is unwholesome. It doesn't say that.
Yeah. Actually, that's the order of the four right strivings.
Yes.
It's always abandoning, preventing restraining unarisen unwholesome states from arising.
Yes.
Abandoning arisen unwholesome states.
Yes.
Then you're in the position to cultivate unarisen unwholesome states. Yeah. And finally, you have to protect the arisen wholesome states.
That's right.
So that's the main issue with that. It's as well as the aspect of timelessness that we mentioned. It's not the Dhamma is supposed to be directly visible.
Yeah.
So what happens if somebody can't get themselves to feel love? Then like the benefit of the Dhamma wouldn't be directly visible because it takes time to change your mind to force it to have these states. But if it's about non-greed, well, that's always presently possible. It's about not making a choice of greed, not making a choice of aversion. That's always directly available.
Yeah, and even when the mind is affected by greed, to not act out by body, speech, or as we discussed earlier on the mental level, right? That is already how there is that purity. So then the mind can still be affected by, let's say, sensuality, but there would be purity as long as there's no acting out by body, speech, and mind. Yeah,
and that doesn't depend on time, and it doesn't depend on you, on somebody else telling you like if you do this you will end up with love later on.
That's right. Non-acting out doesn't depend on time.
Yeah.
You just immediately don't do it.
Yeah.
Whereas to positively do something will always in that sense involve time, because it might take a little while before you're going to see the results.
Yeah.
And so that's not timeless Dhamma anymore then.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, even if it's as quick as just thinking a thought of love, it's already, even if it's like a that quick of time is still.
Yeah.
And also like you never start from that. Like you would have started from a point of view where it took time, and you would have taken it on faith that somebody else told you you will end up there, which means you didn't use this advice. You just found one guy who was telling you something and you followed that, but you never actually understood presently what is that non-greed and how can I abandon it. You just, somebody else told you, like, do this, and you end up with the opposite.
Yeah, that is why there's this whole idea of applying an antidote. Like, I feel ill will, I should practice metta as an antidote to the ill will. But that's a misunderstanding. Like, sometimes it seems to me that's also sort of an import from a more, let's say, scientific or biological way of thinking. Like, when the body is ill, you might find herbs and medications, something external to this body that you apply in order to heal. So on the material level, there is something to say for this whole logic of applying antidotes.
You apply the antidote,
but you cannot take that and then apply it to the level of the mind, because that's a confusion.
Yeah, no, but even on the level of the body, you apply this medicine, but did you understand what the source of the problem was in the first place, or did the pain just go away?
Yeah.
So that's the thing. Like, people can succeed in developing love or whatever, but if you ask them, what was that ill will that you abandoned in the first place? Was it just unpleasant feelings that came up by themselves? And if you look closely, most of the time, that's the implication. Ill will was just the fact that I didn't feel the way I feel now. Whereas if you read the suttas, that's not what ill will is.
No.
Ill will is not unpleasant feeling. Ill will is a choice that you make on top of unpleasant feeling. And if you don't understand that, well, again, the only way you will be able to make progress is through some external information.
Yeah, and you will never be able to resolve doubt as long as it stays on that external level.
Yeah, because do I have enough love?
Yeah, and in that sense, like, it's never enough, because it's like, I can cultivate this kind of sort of active external love, but that's actually rooted in craving, because I'm chasing something.
Yeah.
So that when I come back, I stop. Oh, craving is already there again. So I need to build up and got more, and then more, and then more. And
it's building up the discrepancy. It's like you're trying to fill something up, and at the same time, through that very action, you're emptying it from like another side that you don't notice.
Yeah. Plus, you need to then keep maintaining that as well.
Yeah.
Right. So there cannot be, let's say, full ease or as a goal, because if it's about cultivating positively these states, if you stop doing that, if you feel that your love then diminishes, so that you need to keep maintaining it, then you will remain dependent on those activities, and so that's not going to result in freedom, because in order to keep doing that, again, many other things need to be in place that are beyond your control. So, but the undoing, once it's undone, it's finished basically.
Yeah.
And positively, nothing needs to happen, because nothing unwholesome can come about anymore, because you uprooted the unwholesome.
Yeah.